Thank you, Peter, for introducing me, and I want to know if my English is understandable to most of you. How many of you have been to the Silicon Valley area, to San Francisco, before? Just a handful, yeah. Do you all know the story of how Electronic Arts got started? Or do you feel like you know how it got started?
Yeah.
Or do you know the company?
Yes.
EA Sports? All right. Well, what I'm wanting to do today, if you'd like to hear about it, I want to tell my story of how I lived it 33 years ago. It was 1982 when we started the company. Prior to that, because Peter mentioned it, and it was significant even for me to become a part of Electronic Arts, was that I had worked at Atari during its heyday, during its height. I left about 6 months before it started to just decline. Of course, I had no idea about that. I was telling a story earlier that when I left Atari, there were about 3,000 employees. When I joined, there were 1,000, so it was already a big company, because I think it was started in 1972 by Nolan Bushnell. By the time I got there, Warner Communications owned it. But still, we were growing so fast, it was a multi-billion-dollar company, that I was the second person hired to develop the Atari computer market in Europe and the Middle East. So Atari did have some really advanced, for the time, computers, an Atari 800 and an Atari 400. And both of them had extra chipsets that none of the other microcomputer or home computers at the time had, which made Atari a particularly wonderful gaming machine. But when I left, it was August of 1982, the president of the international division, when he was talking to me about leaving, I called it, actually my immediate superior called him on the phone the evening I left and told him that, and he tried to convince me to stay. He said, you know, Warner Communications will always have a job for you. Atari is the most, it's a once-in-a-lifetime company to be a part of, and startups always fail, or you'll never make it. And I said, well, I've already decided I'm leaving. He said, okay, in that case, I will I'll personally make sure that you never get a job in Silicon Valley again. And then he had me searched and escorted out of the building. As I say, about 6 months later, Atari started to just decline and never caught up with itself. So what ended up happening, well, I'm going to give you a little bit of more background, because I wanted to set the context for startup companies, particularly Electronic Arts, in the Stanford community, because it makes a big difference, I think, that Stanford was a particularly important catalyst for what happened and what created Silicon Valley. And it's unique, I think, in the world, because as an educational institution, first of all, there's probably today a myth still around that Silicon Valley was created by private venture capital. That couldn't be further from reality. The Silicon Valley started through Stanford and UC Berkeley with government funding for startup companies. The difference between those two major universities was that Stanford's engineering dean decided to make encourage, actually he forced his faculty, if they wanted to become a tenured faculty member. Do you know what tenure is? It means that it's a lifetime position, which faculty members do acquire in the United States. They can, once they have tenure, then they can't be fired, and so it's a lifetime appointment. Well, normally, traditionally, the tenure was anointed to someone because based on their research and their publications. The more they could publish in journals and books and that kind of stuff, that was a requirement for them to obtain tenure in all universities. Well, at the dean of the engineering school, his name was Fred Terman. His requirement for his faculty in the engineering to acquire tenure was that they start a company, that they leave the university, found a company, and then they could come back and join the faculty again, and that made them eligible to get tenure. If they didn't go start a company, they couldn't get tenure. So that made a huge difference in the way Stanford kind of encouraged the creation of the formation of companies. How did they get funded? Well, it was post-World War II, and the government was pouring money into major universities, both Berkeley and Stanford. And so the faculty that left Stanford all got funded through the government. And they made lots of money. Many of them made lots of money. And so over the years, it evolved that, with tax law changes and other things, that the funding eventually changed from coming from the government primarily to being sourced from private entities, venture capital funds and that kind of thing. Venture capitalists started just as wealthy families, the Rockefellers and that kind of family, having funds that they invested from their own family sources. But eventually they evolved into companies, into funds that, because they did so well with that large corporations, large pension funds, other kind of entities that had lots of cash and they needed to make sure that it was invested in a way that would give them a good return, they started pouring money into the private venture capital firms. And so now, yeah, there are billions and billions and billions of dollars under management at venture capital firms in Palo Alto or Menlo Park on Sand Hill Road, and they're private. So now the reality is it's mostly private funding, not government funding in the US, but definitely it was started. It was initiated by the government, and I think people lose sight of that over the years. So Stanford had a big influence on it, and the other thing that Stanford did was back when it was started in 1885, its founding grant said that the objective of the university was to qualify its students for personal success and direct usefulness in life. So that was a mindset that most universities, traditional universities in Europe and in the United States too, because Harvard was started in 1626 or something like that. And even today, when I travel around Europe and talk to presidents of universities, if I ask them, what the mission of their university is, they tell me it's teaching and research. And I say, well, what about entrepreneurship? And they say, oh, well, no, we're a teaching institution. We're a research institution. And Stanford never defined itself like that. Stanford defined itself as with an objective to make its students have personal success and have a direct usefulness in life. Well, that makes things happen totally differently. And it leads to independent study, really, of students. I was lucky to be able to do field research in West Africa when I was an undergraduate at Stanford. It was in a village out in the middle of a jungle, and I collected folklore from Amandakpele of Liberia, and did a thesis on that my senior year at Stanford. This was back in 1971 and 2. And so that created, I attribute to that a sort of a mindset of being on your own, independent, and therefore kind of an entrepreneur. Even when you were a student, you had to live like that. And I think that's inbred in all the students that go through Stanford. Less so at Berkeley. Berkeley's much bigger and has, its students are treated more like numbers. There's 40,000 students at UC Berkeley and only 15,000 at Stanford, so that's a big difference. But the point is, the education that you get can help formulate and change your mindset to encourage you to go out and be on your own and figure things out for yourself and not be in a position of just being a cog in a large corporation. And so that's part of what is unique about Silicon Valley. Let's jump to the beginning of electronic arts. The other myth that I think exists was that every company in the Bay Area started in a garage. The garage on the left is the actual Hewlett-Packard garage where Dave Packard and Bill Hewlett started Hewlett-Packard. And if you see movies about Apple, you know that they started in Steve Jobs' family's garage. But we didn't. We started had our first meeting in a very nice home in Portola Valley that was owned by our CEO, Trip Hawkins. Trip had worked, he and I had been in business school together at Stanford, and he got out and worked for Apple, went to work for Apple. He was employee number 50, so that by 1982, that was in 78, Apple went public in 1980. Trip ended up with about something under $10 million in Apple stock. So he was at 28 in 1982. He was well off. So he had a beautiful home. He invited five of us to dinner at his house. And he knew all of the people at dinner. I knew three. I knew Trip, Bing, because the three of us had been at Stanford Business School, but I didn't know the other three. And so the six people that were at his dinner were Trip Hawkins, Rich Melman, who was about 10 years older than the rest of us. He had been the vice president. He was the vice president of marketing at VisiCorp, which was the maker of VisiCalc, which was the first spreadsheet product that was very successful on the Apple II. Bing Gordon, Trip, by the way, went to Harvard as an undergraduate and Stanford Business School. Rich Melman was a physics major at UC Berkeley and a Stanford MBA. Bing was an English major at Yale and a Stanford MBA. I was an anthropology major at Stanford and a Stanford MBA. Dave Evans was an undergraduate at Stanford and got his master's there too in mechanical engineering. And Pat Marriott, the only woman in the group, didn't go to Stanford. And frankly, I don't remember where she went to school, but 5 of the 6 of us were Stanford grads. So we had something in common. 3 of us were in the same class at business school. And so Trip and Rich were both in a position to provide seed funding for us to start the company. So in July of '82, we had this dinner, talked about the kind of company we wanted to start. And then in August, we all got called by Trip. And I remember the phone call, he said, "Jeff, are you ready to leave Atari?" Where I was an executive and was making a good salary. And I said, "Well, you know, it's risky to do a startup." Yes, I'm sort of on board. He said, "Well, you know, take your time, but let me tell you, the other 5 people that were at dinner have already agreed to join. They've agreed to leave their positions and they're joining." I said, "Oh, okay, I'm in. I'll do it too." Because really the group of people that he pulled together were the smartest and most talented people. Not one of them was a programmer. We were all marketing executives. Bing was in the advertising industry. But they were really, really brilliant and talented, I thought. Probably the most brilliant group that I'd ever been involved with. So I said, "Sure, I'm in." Of course, later we found out that he told each one of us that. And we didn't bother to check with each other to see if if everybody else had already said yes. So it was a trick, but it worked. And so from August, when we all left our companies and started working together, until November, it took us only, what, 4 months to raise $5 million with 3 top-tier venture firms. This was our first office building. Soon as I left Atari, we moved into this office building on Airport Boulevard. And just to show again that we weren't ever a garage company, we moved shortly thereafter to this building in San Mateo. Then for many years we were on Gateway Drive in San Mateo. We moved to this complex, basically across from that previous building, across the freeway from that previous building. And then finally, after we went public, we built our own campus in Redwood City, which has 3 or 4 buildings there that are spread out a little bit, but it's on Electronic Arts Drive. Back to 1983, there was this ad. Of course, we had in 1983, there was nothing but television or print for advertising. Radio, but radio was not that effective. So we ran this ad in Newsweek and Scientific American. It was a double-page spread, and we were trying to position the company with what we believed in, what we all bought into. And this picture, we spared no expense either, because we had the investments and see this Beatles album? Do you remember that one? We hired the same photographer that did that photograph to take a group photo of all of our artists. So the first artists that we brought into, well, they were on contracts, they were independent, but we had a couple of people that were producers that scoured the United States to try to find these developers. The best, they go to development groups like this and see who was really good and who had a product mostly completed. And we ended up with this group of artists was our first group, and they produced our first products. Mind you, we didn't have any products when we got the funding from the venture firms. They were just based, we got the funding really based on who we were and their belief that we could produce. Of course, they also knew that Tripp had the money to fund us anyway. If they didn't decided not to, he could do it personally, so they really wanted in. Let's see here. So here are the names of the people that were our first artists. And I want to quickly, if I can, read to you the text of the ad, because it was quite unusual for 1983. And I suspect none of you have ever read that ad. Have you ever seen that photo of our artists? Okay, so it started out with a strange title, Can a Computer Make You Cry? And it goes, right now no one knows. This is partly because many would consider the very idea frivolous, but it's also because whoever successfully answers this question must first have answered several others. Why do we cry? Why do we laugh or love or smile? What are the touchstones of our emotions? Until now, the people who asked such questions tended not to be the same people who ran software companies. Instead, they were writers, filmmakers, painters, musicians. They were, in the traditional sense, artists. We're about to change that tradition. The name of our company is Electronic Arts. Software worthy of the minds that use it. We are a new association of electronic artists united by a common goal to fulfill the enormous potential of the personal computer. In the short term, this means transcending its present use as a facilitator of unimaginative tasks and a medium for blasting aliens. In the long term, however, we can expect a great deal more. These are wondrous machines we have created, and in them can be seen a bit of their makers. It is as if we had invested them with the image of our minds. And through them, we are learning more and more about ourselves. We learn, for instance, that we are more entertained by the involvement of our imaginations than by passive viewing and listening. We learn that we are better taught by experiences than by memorization. And we learn that the traditional distinctions, the ones that are made between art and entertainment and education, don't always apply. Toward a language of dreams. In short, we are finding that the computer can be more than just a processor of data. It is a communications medium, an interactive tool that can bring people's thoughts and feelings closer together, perhaps closer than ever before. And while 50 years from now, its creation may seem no more important than the advent of motion pictures or television, there is a chance it will mean something more. Something along the lines of a universal language of ideas and emotions. Something like a smile. The first publications of electronic arts are now available. We suspect you'll be hearing a lot about them. Some of them are games like you've never seen before. They get more out of your computer than other games ever have. Others are harder to categorize, and we like that. Watch us. We're providing a special environment for talented, independent software artists. It's a supportive environment in which big ideas are given the room to grow. And some of America's most respected software artists are beginning to take notice. One more little bit here. We think our current work reflects this very special commitment. And though we are few in number today and apart from the mainstream of the mass software marketplace, we are confident that both time and vision are on our side. Join us, we see farther. So that was the basis. We captured, our advertising agency captured what we believed about the video game business, about the computer gaming business in 33 years ago. And that set the whole tone for electronic arts. I want to show you some clips from a video that was made in 1983 that kind of was some of our executives speaking about what we were up to. It was never seen publicly because we did it just for developing our, kind of onboarding our sales team. And so it was never a public video. But these are just clips from it. So what were we thinking?
In order for us to do what we are trying to do, we have to be obsessed, and we have to be a little bit arrogant, and we have to be a little bit cocky about having a sense of possibilities that are open to us that aren't open to others because of our convictions. And if we didn't feel that way, if we didn't even have a little bit of sense of not knowing what we don't know, and you know, if we were too conscious of the pitfalls, if we were too conscious of the obstacles, we might lose our conviction. And we really do have a sense of really being obsessed with it and really believing that we know how to do it better than everybody else. And that may seem arrogant, but if we didn't feel that way, we wouldn't be able to pull it off. And it's because we feel that way that we're going to.
Okay, so the point of that, 30 years ago, that was the mindset of a founder of a company. Tripp perfectly exemplifies that or describes it. And having been the executive director of Berkeley's accelerators, startup accelerator for the past 3 years, although I've left that position, I show this all the time because it's the same attitude that the startup founders in the United States, in the Bay Area, from Berkeley, have today. Nothing's changed in that regard. You have to believe in yourself more than it might seem reasonable to you. And I know that there are cultural differences that kind of prohibit your feeling like you can think that about yourselves, but that's the method, that's the mindset that startup entrepreneurs in the Bay Area have.
It's possible for a computer to provide a world where the rules are open-ended, where if you're flying around the planet, you decide to take off toward that star, you can. We can evoke in people a sense of, wonder, curiosity, intrigue, maybe a little smile for a grandson who learned how to do something on a grandfather's machine. I'd like to write some software that interacts with you in a way that's really close to the way a person would interact with you. You may become attached to some of the software characters, and you may develop emotional feelings about some of the personalities in the software. That's why I've been mentioning the idea of a software friend. And that sort of should be built in here, but it can be built into a program too. A lot of good designs just cause you to smile. I mean, you look at it and you want to smile. We're at the start of things and it's just settling down. How this business is really going to be run and organized is, I think Electronic Arts is going to be one of the leaders because of the professionalism of the people that are planning the organization and doing a lot of thinking about the structure of the artist relative to the producer inside the company, relative to the production and distribution aspects all being, integrated into one package. It's more or less where the thinking's got to be. It used to be just a guy in his garage can start selling. And that's still true today to some extent. But it doesn't go very far. And Budge could tell you, you can try that and you get your family involved in working on it. But in the end, you really need to understand how to market the product as well as develop it.
Okay, so 33 years ago, we were thinking about a software friend. There was no internet, there was no conception of an internet at that time, at least among us. I think the Defense Department already had the internet up and running for themselves, but it was not a public thing, and we didn't know about it. And yet we were trying to infuse the games that we had with an emotional power, a stickiness. I remember we used to use the phrase simple, hot, and deep as the descriptions, the concise description of what we wanted our software to be. But it always amazes me to think that far back we were thinking about making an interaction with a computer more like an interaction with a person. And I think that finally, after, I would say, what we wanted to create in 1983 was this kind of thing. Okay, so you all know that as FIFA football. That's much closer to what we wanted to do 30 years ago. It took us until what, 2000. This is probably FIFA 2006 or 7, maybe more recent. I don't remember where I grabbed this clip, but I remember in '96 I walked into a sports bar and saw a bunch of television monitors with Sunday afternoon football games, American football games, on them. And one of them I had to look at twice, and I thought, which game is that? And then I realized it was John Madden Football. It was a video game. And that's what we wanted to get to, was the point of having our software look so realistic and be able to be so flexible that you had a hard time distinguishing it from reality. And so we realized our dreams, I think. We also built a company culture, and I'd say that that's a very important thing to think about too. We did every week had beer and wine on Fridays and a company meeting, at which all of the executives of the company would stand up in front of all the company members and answer any question anybody wanted to ask. And even, I think that in the American culture, it's much more common to ask not embarrassing, but hard questions, straight questions. And so, but people at Electronic Arts got used to the fact that any question they wanted answered, they could ask it in public. And Tripp and the rest of us on the executive committee would do our best to answer that question. And so we erred on the side of giving too much information to our employees rather than giving too little, because we wanted transparency. We wanted them to think and understand that we were listening to them. One of the things we did too was that until we had 100 employees, every person that applied for a job at Electronic Arts was interviewed by every current employee at Electronic Arts. So as we got closer to 100 people, it became unwieldy because it would take 3 or 4 weeks for somebody to go through the interview process in order to get a job, no matter if it was a clerk in the warehouse where we were doing our shipping, or you know, a top engineer for us. But what that did for the first year or two, because it took us about a year or so to reach 100 people, was that it made the applicants feel like, after this harrowing experience of interviewing so many people, and they got once they got accepted or offered the job, they felt like they were fantastic. They must be, to get the job after going through all this interviewing process. And the people in the company all felt like, you know, I got a chance to, you know, have something to do with the process of selecting our next, you know, employees. And so it was a very a strong way of maintaining a corporate culture. We also used to take the whole company to movie openings. This one, I remember we took a morning and hired a theater, and back then we didn't have big projection screens like this in companies, so we had to go watch in the movie theater. It was because it was something that we felt like everybody in Electronic Arts should be aware of these things. Of course, the Star Wars movies were similar too. We also put together a bunch of covers of current songs from the 80s that had lyrics that our own employees had substituted, and then the whole company participated in performing these. We took a day and did a whole set of recordings of these covers with our own lyrics. This is a Run DMC song called Walk This Way, I think.
We give you by 10, drink our coffee till 11, we are lords of a private domain. At the suspense, staring at the Ethernet, composing numbers no smallest to a credit. Then we have a week meeting in the room with all the seating. When your ego is that big, you need the space. Still saw this room as what a funny sense of human marketing makes working anytime. Larry's wardrobe can't be safer. Is he a neck away? It's a pity that his tailor has gone blind. Motley Crue's pretty weird. To work there, you need a beard, but they never get their software done on time. Rippers can give me a culture watch. We swim it like a vulture, so you gotta memorize the party line. He tells you to work this way. Swim all day. Work this way. 48. Work this way. Earn your pay. Work this way. 'Cause we save money free.
All right, so we had about 18 songs that our employees wrote the lyrics for, and we all spent the day performing them. It created a really powerful company culture for us, even after we had 300, 400, 500 people in the company. Interestingly, last month I had lunch at Google, their headquarters campus down in Mountain View, and we passed by a room, and the guy I was with said, "Oh, that's where we hold our weekly company meeting." And Larry and Sergey stand up in front of the company, and anybody can ask any question, and they'll answer it. I thought, interesting. I've heard of that before, but it is an effective way of building a company that feels. That makes people feel like they are completely a part of it. And of course, even now, Electronic Arts gives stock options to people when they join the company. They're of course not as valuable as 30 years ago, but still everybody has stock in the company, and always did. Same thing with Google and Facebook and all of those companies. But we did have hard stuff to go through. It was never easy, and it is never easy to create a company like this. You know, not only were the founders gone after 9 years, except for one. Bing stayed for 26 years. But the rest of us were out of there, including the CEO, Tripp. And I have to say that since that first year, the 6 of us have never been in the same room together again. So we weren't, you know, bosom buddies that were, you know, stuck together through thick and thin. We had our breakups, and you know, Trip and Bing won't be in the same room together at all. Haven't spoken for years. I'm still sort of friends, or at least acquaintances, with all of them. I had lunch with Trip about a month ago, so we try to keep up with each other somewhat. Bing used to live a block from me in Woodside, and so I always saw him, and we were friends. But the fact of the matter is, you do have problems with your company's management and getting along, no matter what. Our whole idea of having programmers become rock stars, it didn't really work. I mean, we expected a loyal fan base to develop for our developers. You know, in our packaging, we had interviews with the artists about liner notes in the packaging, asking the artists why they produced it, what it meant to them, how they did it, and all that stuff. We thought that would be compelling to the general public, to consumers. It wasn't that compelling. And also, the fact of the matter is, back then, and maybe it's the same today, I don't know, there were each of the independent artists, anyway, that we had, only had about 2 or 3 products in them. It wasn't like they could continue year after year, or decade after decade, to come up with new games. After about 3, they'd kind of peter out. So, and of course things got so much more complicated. Well, first of all, we had to start publishing, we had to start, well, we thought we had to publish productivity software as well as games. We spent a year doing that and spent millions of dollars, and we couldn't do it. We failed miserably on that. So we had to go back to just games, and we had to become a distributor for other people's games, which was a big controversy in the company. We thought we would only ever publish our own developed, or the games that our own people that we had on contract would develop. But that turned out to not be, we couldn't get enough good products, so we'd had to go distribute other people's good products, like Origin Systems. I don't know if you ever heard of them. They were, had a role-playing game called something, I can't think of it. Anyway, we had to distribute their products. We ended up buying them because we got so successful that we were able to just buy the people that we were otherwise distributing. But still, that was a complete departure from what our original plan was. Our games got so complex we had to bring them in-house to be able to develop them, add music and graphics and all the features that only a team of people, a large team of people could add, made it be more like a movie production rather than a game production. And then the internet. You know, Electronic Arts was not really ready for the internet. At least it hadn't built itself. We had direct relationships with retailers. Well, we needed we had to remain loyal to them, but continue to produce products they could sell off their shelves. The internet didn't lend itself to that. Our products were so big and so complicated that unless you had really broadband, high-speed internet connection, you really couldn't download them. You certainly couldn't stream them. And so we bought a company called Playfish, I think, that was a mobile game or a mobile game developer. But it hasn't been a huge success for us. For Electronic Arts, it's not us, and I'm not part of it anymore, but I don't think that they've still figured out how to fully take advantage of the internet, or the internet hasn't developed well enough or fast enough or with the capabilities to help Electronic Arts be successful with it. The nice thing is, like Apple, or similar to Apple, because nothing's like Apple, Electronic Arts has acquired a huge amount of cash. So they'll be able to last, if they're smart, and they are, they'll be able to figure out how they can navigate the next few years and end up with a next generation of things that'll keep them going. So they're not in any danger of going out of business, at least not for another 10, 12 years, something like that. So lessons, I would say that one of the most important things is to pull together when you start a company the smartest people you know, the most talented people that you know. You know, it's almost like a good team can make an ordinary sort of mediocre product successful. A team that's not so good can't make the best product in the world succeed. So you really want to go after the smartest people you can think of. Also, I think that it makes sense. This is your life you're talking about, so make the biggest impact you possibly can. Try to change the world. That's the way people in the Bay Area may feel about their endeavors. Only a few of them reach that, but that's what they all start out feeling like. And I think that's appropriate. Always be honest. That's the other thing. You can't, over time, you can't survive if you're not totally honest and open and straightforward and speak your mind. Don't be political, in other words. That's the downfall of many companies, that people are doing things that are not what they truly believe, but that they think they're supposed to do to get ahead, and it never works. Also, a ton of money doesn't solve everything, and I don't know if that's something that people, maybe you can't understand it until you've lived through it. When you have so much money that you don't know what to do with it, it doesn't help the rest of your life at all. It doesn't give you a reason for being. It doesn't give you a reason for living. It doesn't solve your problems except your financial problems. And even then, a lot of people I noticed who became multimillionaires out of the Electronic Arts experience stopped worrying about how they were going to pay bills and started worrying about how they were going to keep their money. And so those were just worriers. I mean, it didn't help them at all to have a lot of money. They were just as anxious about having a lot as not having any. And certainly it doesn't solve the personal issues in your life at all. Your personal relationships, if anything, grow more complicated with a lot of money. So it's not an end goal to think that everything will be okay if you get a lot of money, because it just doesn't happen. Oops, where'd I go? Okay, finally, the last thing is, and this is ubiquitous in the Bay Area, and I think as people get reach success here in Poland, it'll become the same here, and that is people all give back, and I don't mean give money back. They invest. That's one of the things. Everybody that was made a multimillionaire by Electronic Arts public offering has invested in other companies. They didn't give the money to them, they invested it, but they helped others grow their businesses by being mentors, by providing capital as investments for them to succeed. And so there's a virtuous cycle in the Bay Area anyway, that everybody and an unwritten rule. If you make millions in a company, the ethics are that you reinvest in other startup companies too, so they have the same opportunity to do it. And really, you are some of the luckiest people in the world to be able to be an entrepreneur and a startup founder. That's still a very unique experience, and one that is extremely valuable. And people ask me, isn't it kind of too late to get into the gaming industry, or hasn't everything been done? Isn't the competition too stiff? And my feeling is that in my lifetime, there's never been a better time to start a company than right now. The market is just still exploding, and it's so much bigger than what we had in 1983 when we started. I mean, there were maybe 3 or 4 million computers installed in homes in 1983. It's not much of a market compared to 5 billion phones, and the smartphones are beginning to take over, occupy all of that space. And of course, with the internet, it's just a great time to start a business. So I can't encourage you more than to say if you're thinking about getting into a startup business, it's the best time in the world to do it. So that's my pitch. If I can answer any questions from anybody, I'd be happy to about the early days of Electronic Arts or even Atari. As I say, Atari started to decline in about 1982. But any questions? Yes, this gentleman here raised his hand.
There was a screen with some first games of EA.
Yes.
Is it possible to somehow
Yeah.
play them?
Possible to what? Go back to them, or for me to name them?
Play them.
Oh, play them.
Some kind of emulator or something.
You know, that's a great question. They were on 5 1/4-inch floppy disk drives. So I don't know. I think you'd have to. Electronic Arts doesn't issue them any longer. They're out of print, if you will. So I don't know the answer to that. I'm sure you can find a floppy drive. How would you connect it? You'd have to find an old, yeah, an old Atari 800 or Apple II. A lot of those still exist, and I'm sure that, I suspect. But that's a good question. I bet you one of these days, Electronic Arts will decide, hey, we're going to go back to our original catalog and try to figure out some of the products that were successful then and update them. You know, Archon was a fantastic board game in kind of a fantasy world. It was great. It was like chess or something like that, but they were characters that were kind of mythical characters that you moved around the board, and it was a fascinating game. Mule was a great strategy board game again, but with a lot of animation and interesting competition going on. Bill Budge's Pinball Construction Center, I don't know if you've ever heard of that. It was the first product that allowed you to build your own, the screen was split in half, had pieces of a pinball game board, on one side, and you could drag and drop them onto the other half of the screen and build your own pinball game and then play it. That was the first in 83 when we released it. That was the first game with this kind of construction set model that had existed. And it's still a very interesting game to play, if you can find the disk drive. Oh, another question. Yeah, sorry.
How long did you stay at EA for, and what did you move on to next?
I guess I'd have to call myself a typical serial entrepreneur. I never worked any place more than 7 years. I was at Electronic Arts 7 years. It was right after, the year we went public is when I left. Partly because I was in charge of international business, and we had a subsidiary we just opened in London, and I had established the subsidiary in Tokyo as well. And I was traveling 50% of the time. A week every month in London, a week every month in Tokyo. I had little children, and I realized I didn't want to be gone from my kids that much when they were that young. And I didn't have to work anymore. So I decided to leave and handle my own portfolio and be with my kids. After that, I wanted to put my wife was a Stanford grad and a brilliant writer, and she'd always wanted to be an author, so we bought a printing publishing firm and we put her in the business as a publisher. It was a bit of a disaster. We published 22 books for her. She wrote 3 or 4 of them, but the publishing industry is deadly. So that was a mess. Then I did startups. That took us to about 1996, and the internet was coming alive then, and so I started hiring graduates with CS degrees, computer science degrees from Stanford, because they all knew some, you know, they'd all studied the internet and could deal with HTML and I don't even know what other languages were popular or prevalent back then, but every one of the graduates had an idea for something a business to develop on the internet, and so I'd hire them, we'd start a little company and end up selling it. They usually lasted 2 years, 3 years, something like that, and did 4 or 5 of those. I got into the ticketing industry. I bought a company. After the crash, there was a Stanford students forum had started a ticketing company, electronic ticketing, and they went out of business because after the crash they couldn't raise a second round of funding. They raised $5 million. They went into bankruptcy, out of bankruptcy and continued. We changed the direction of the company, and that lasted 7 years. Then I opened a club in Italy, in Florence. After my kids were grown and out of the house, and I raised my own kids because after the fiasco with the publishing industry thing, my wife and I got divorced, and so I raised the kids. And once they were out of the house, I decided I'm free, and I moved to Florence, where I had studied at Stanford, and opened a club there in a 5-star resort hotel. And after that, I joined a filmmaker in Hollywood, a Polish filmmaker, as a matter of fact, who had made about 50 films in his lifetime. He had been at the American Film Institute in 1968 at age 20 or something like that, when all the Jews in Poland were exiled or lost their citizenship or whatever, so he had to stay in the United States because he was Jewish, and his father had been the minister of film in Poland after the war. And of course his father got exiled too, even though he had been a really good, close friend of the president of Poland during that time period. But anyway, so he brought me on as a co-producer of movies, of some of his portfolio movies. He was indie and independent, and so I was in Hollywood for 3 years working on in that regard. And then I was recruited by UC Berkeley to start their startup accelerator about 3 years ago. So I moved back up from Southern California and did that, and because Berkeley is a state-owned and run institution, they were not willing to reach out to the rest of the world to bring companies from other countries into Silicon Valley to accelerate them and introduce them to all of the aspects of what is special about Silicon Valley, investors and mentors and that kind of thing. Berkeley just didn't want to do it. They said, oh, we're a state school, we can't do that. So I left that last fall and now am working with QBN and others where I'm going to be doing a pilot. We'll be doing a pilot. Piotr and I will be doing a pilot with StartX, which is the Stanford University's accelerator, who has previous to this moment not ever allowed anybody that wasn't a Stanford alum to apply. Although they've been in existence for 5 years, they've raised, the companies that have gone through StartX have raised in venture money more than $700 million. The 3 years I was at Berkeley, our companies, who were excellent, raised more than $10 million. Huge difference. And so, you know, I'm very interested in continuing to try to bring the best companies from other countries into the realm of Silicon Valley. Of course, the investors there who are sitting on billions of dollars of investment funds, they're always looking for a better deal flow. And I believe that it's entirely realistic to think that companies, good companies from other countries around the world should have the opportunity to come to the Bay Area and gain the exposure that they need in order to potentially have a ton of success themselves. And then go back to their countries and give back. You know, there are plenty of, not plenty, there are a few great examples. Prezi is one that was a Budapest company that came to the Bay Area, and now they have offices in both Budapest and San Francisco. Of course, everybody knows Skype as a good example of that. There are almost every country has one or two examples of very, very successful companies. And so it just is going to take a while, I think, for that ethic to develop, that the companies who succeed can help other companies in their countries get going.
That's what exactly happened with Unity. So we originate from Denmark, and our CEO.
I wondered. I thought. Okay. I didn't remember where Unity started. Yeah.
He got venture capitals, and then he moved back to Denmark.
Yeah.
That's exactly what we've done.
Yeah. There's a number of companies that have done that, and that's what I think. You know, in today's age of the internet, that's what's going to. It's a worldwide market, no matter what you do, and so you need to be able to take advantage of that. And I think that that'll help both bring the world together and promote economic growth in countries that I think that any country that ignores this opportunity is like a country that figured they didn't need to join the Industrial Revolution back in the 1800s. They're going to be left behind. Other question? Yes, sir. Do I still play games? No. No, basically because I'm 65. I have so much to do. My calendar is so filled. I don't have time to get into any of the more complex games, which are the only ones that would interest me. I've never played Angry Birds. I've never played Clash of Clans. Or Candy something? Candy Crush? You know, when I saw that happening, it was Facebook games at first, like Farmville, those kinds of games. When they started appearing on Facebook, I was very disappointed because I felt like it was a complete reversal of all the advances that Electronic Arts had worked for so many years to try to bring to the gaming market. We were going back to stick figures that were, you know, simple, dumb things. But in reality, and I still feel that way a little bit, but in reality what that did was open up a much, much bigger market, a huge market of people that had never before played games, and so that was a good thing for them. But no, I don't take the time. No. I don't. Any other questions I can answer? All right. Well, thank you for your attention.